I was asked to speak, I said, well, what do you want me to talk about? And the response was, well, we want you to set up the moral argument for change. So I will attempt to do that by sharing a couple of stories. The first one is of attending the last day of hearings of the Grenfell inquiry. And I'm going to read it because I can't get through it without reading it. So I'm just going to read it. I steel myself as the guards guide me through the security checks. It's the last day of the Grenfell inquiry hearings. This final module sets out the individual circumstances surrounding each death. I'm here to attend the hearings of my former neighbours, the Al-Wahhabis. They all died in their home, flat 182 on the 21st floor. Abdulaziz's sister, Hanan, lived on the 9th floor and escaped from the tower with her husband and 2 children. The conditions on the 21st floor were rapidly deteriorating and changing. And it's against that backdrop that we hear about the numerous emergency calls that were made and the advice given to stay in their flat and wait for the fire service. One call to a control room operator lasted 59 minutes, beginning at 1:38, less than an hour after the fire started. The operator repeatedly tells the family to stay in their flat, saying that the firefighters would be coming soon and would have oxygen. As the conditions worsen, she tells them to close the windows, cover their faces, and move to the bedroom. Just after 2:21, the control room operator was told by the family that the fire was in the corridor of the flat and that the smoke was coming into the bedroom. She told the family to cover their mouths and to get as close to the floor as they could. In another call at 2:47, the family say they are now under the bed. Nahuda says, "We are dying and we can't get out." They are told the fire service is on the way. Abdulaziz says, "I could have got out a long time ago. We could have, but they said, stay in the flat. We stayed in the flat. We didn't leave." In the final calls with the control room, the family are advised to leave, but they say it's too late as there's too much smoke and they cannot breathe. According to the archaeological records, they all died in one of the bedrooms. They were lying close together. Juxtaposed with those calls, outside of the tower, Hanan and other members of her family were having desperate phone calls with the Al-Wahhabis, pleading with them to get out. They stood outside the tower, watching the horror of the spreading flames unfold. They could see Abdulaziz and his family inside their flat at the windows. According to protocols, flat 182 should have been a priority for evacuation, as it was known there were children present. There were no firefighter crews deployed or making it to the floor. In the words of counsel Mary Monroe, one branch of the family survived: Hanan, her husband, and her children. They did not make any emergency calls. They evacuated and survived. They lived to mourn and question why. I struggle to reconcile the faith that the Al-Wahhabis placed in the control room operators' advice, listening to them over what their family was saying. That afternoon has changed me in ways I don't understand yet. It's made me think very differently about the burden of leadership and about the advice we give and the decisions we take, about the very real consequences of our failure to learn from tragic events. So the point is that neither the Al-Wahhabis or the fire service should ever have been in the position to deal with or make the decisions they had to that night. The failure is ours. The failure is one of the built environment. So I've worked for years in oil and gas industry, high hazard industries. I've studied major accidents for decades. I expected when Grenfell happened that there would be multiple failures. But I have been astounded, shocked, and appalled at how it seems that nobody across the supply chain did the job that they were meant to do. From product testing, managing the site, installing windows or not installing cavity barriers, to the design, I can't think of anybody that did the job the way they were meant to do it, or that thought of risk collectively. So one of the things in my explorations post-Grenfell has been to look at this notion of the difference between piecemeal and systemic change. And that mostly our response to disasters or to anything is piecemeal. We think in silos. We think in linear cause and effect bureaucratic ways. We provide old-style leadership. None of this is going to keep our buildings safe. We need to learn to think systemically, and we need to learn to manage risk collectively and systemically across the supply chain. Which leads me to my second story. Just before the pandemic, I was a consultant at that time, not with Arup. I went to Baku to work with a number of project teams across the supply chain of a big, complex, high-pressure project. And what we did was spend 2 days in a room together and figure out collectively how we would deal with things when they got tough, how we could manage risk collectively, and most importantly, what we'd do if commercial and contractual pressures were driving bad decisions. This was before the project even started. So I would just like to leave you with the possibility of different ways of working across supply chains. And you know, risk, what's probably more accurate, hazards, don't live in contracts. They live in the real world. The tiny decisions that you might make in some siloed way could have enormous consequences on the system of the building that you might not know about. So until we start to think and collaborate in a systemic way around building safety, we cannot say that we've learned from Grenfell. We cannot say that we've honored the deaths of those 72 lives, including the Al-Wahhabis. I am going to end with one final point, which is the closing statements of Richard Millett. And I hope this lives with you as you go out there and work. Every decision, every act, omission, interpretation, understanding, practice, policy, protocol affects someone somewhere. Someone who is unknown and unseen, but who is an adored child, a beloved sister, a respected uncle, a needed mother. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Gill. That was very moving. And now for Will Pitt, who's technical leader at Laing O'Rourke and chair of the BESA Technical Committee. Will.
Sorry.
That's okay.
Good morning, everybody. I hope you're all well and that you can hear me. So very briefly, my name is Will Pitt, technical leader at Laing O'Rourke, chair of BESA Technical Committee. Just to give you a quick sort of flavour of some of the challenges that we as Tier 1 contractors are experiencing in the world of fire. So very briefly, getting straight involved in some of the challenges, I thought I'd start off with a few kind of headlines, if you like. So I think the industry has evolved to a point where critical areas of fire safety are often passed down the supply chain, often with decisions being made on site when perhaps they shouldn't have been. Maybe we've always done it that way and there hasn't been a problem before. Post-Grenfell, I think it's fair to say there is understandably more emphasis on being able to demonstrate that the building is correctly designed and correctly installed in accordance with the building regulations. Particularly in the building services world, we tend to deal with systems, i.e. individual components that sit together. Now, whilst components might have product test data, when they're put together as a system, quite often being able to demonstrate how they perform together is a particular challenge. You'll be familiar with the REBA Plan of Works. So this is just, if I overlay below that, the new gateway system, which is for relevant buildings for the Building Safety Act. Gateway 2, pre-construction stages in particular, is a real challenge for contractors such as ourselves. When we have to evaluate the risk inherent in designs, quite often when significant elements of the design are not complete, they might be referred to, for example, as CDP or contractor design portion elements. That's a real challenge for us. I'll just give you a couple of examples of some of the real sort of a flavour of the challenges that we're experiencing in the complex and evolving world of fire now. On the left-hand side, penetration seals or passive fire stopping, as some of you may know about this. I think pre-Grenfell, this is one of those areas that wasn't really given a huge amount of consideration. The truth is, it's a massively challenging area for the whole industry, and to get it right requires consideration at design stage, and also involvement from multiple parties in the design process. If I take, for example, the next two, which are kind of linked really, fire dampers and fire-rated ductwork, the challenge here is really one of compatibility. Those products will have been tested with a particular type of substrate or a wall construction. So if you take, for example, a flexible wall, that have both been tested with a particular specification. Any deviation from that on site will effectively mean that what you've installed is a non-standard and untested solution. Obviously, the challenge for industry is that those dampers and the wall will be specified by different people. So you've got this issue of compatibility coming into play. The image on the left is an interesting one. This is where you've got services passing through an encapsulated cell beam. Now, it's not installed yet, but below that cell beam is a fire compartment line. The issue that we have now is that when you pass services through a boarded cell beam, there is no test standard to back off how that performs on site. And this happens all the time. So at the moment, what we're doing to try and remedy this is advise our architects to move the compartment off the fire line. Now, that isn't always possible, but we may alternatives consider dropping the services below the steel beam. Really good example of how steel works, so the structure, the architecture and the MEP need to come together in a holistic way to think about fire safety. Does that happen at the moment? Not always. And the last one here, fire-rated supports and fixings, might not seem that important to you, but anything that has a power supply to a life safety service, whether that be a sprinkler pump or a smoke extract fan or a fire alarm system, will require the power supplies and the support system to have a fire rating that may be up to 2 hours. Now, that particular example here, what I'm trying to articulate, you can see that it's actually being suspended from a hollow core slab. There have been recent examples where the structure of a building is nominally rated for 1 hour, but there's a requirement for services to have a 2-hour rating. You've got a disconnect in terms of ratings. But these are just a few of the examples of the really nuanced and technical challenges that we're experiencing daily at the moment. So in terms of what needs to change, a number of things really. We need to be able to demonstrate that we've got correctly designed, correctly installed solutions. And ultimately, we need to be able to demonstrate we have delivered a building with proven integrated fire safety. Now, this is my opinion. This isn't necessarily Laing O'Rourke's view, but this is what I believe are the kind of things that need to change in the industry. They're quite controversial, but I don't think that's unreasonable. I mean, some of those things on here, I genuinely believe we need to get to a point where designs are much more complete, and we need to stop this concept of lobbing stuff over the fence to contractors with significant parts of the design missing. That then pulls into question, do we need to rethink the way we procure buildings? Possibly. I think we need to fire strategies. We need to have far more understanding. Everybody involved in the process needs to understand the fire strategy in more detail. And I also think the term value engineering, I'm not convinced it's a good term. And I think that in the industry, we need to move away from that. So I think longer term, it may become frowned upon. So I've gone through that very quickly, but hopefully that just gives you a little bit of a flavour of some of the challenges that we as Tier 1 contractors are experiencing in the complex and evolving world of fire. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. Well, interesting that you thought that list was controversial. I thought it was just common sense by and large. Can we put the first poll up while we're introducing our other guests? Please have Dan Gill, if you would go back up. So we've got a couple more joining the expert panel. We've got Ben Adams from Ben Adams Architects and Peter Woodburn from Director of Arup. And finally, someone who needs no real introduction, Hywel Davies, Technical Director of CIBSE, taking the high step route. So on Slido, if you could please vote on these questions. How well prepared are you to demonstrate that your design satisfies functional requirements, the building regs? If you could vote now, please. While we're waiting for those results to come through, one question from me to kick off with. I often talk to members and non-members and others in the construction industry, and I've listened to all the Grenfell podcasts. I see still amazed by how many people for Grenfell could effectively have happened in another country. They have little awareness, little knowledge. They took no interest in the inquiry and no interest in the Building Safety Act. Is that something you see? I'll start with Gill because you kind of led on that.
Sorry, just say again, what's the question?
Too many people in our industry have no interest in what happened at Grenfell. It happened in another country as far as they're concerned.
I think there's a lot of narratives about it doesn't apply here. So I've heard, one of the most depressing days I've ever had since Grenfell, and there've been a number, was when somebody from the construction industry, a very senior person in the construction industry, about 6 months after the fire, said that learning hadn't happened from Grenfell and it had been relegated to an isolated housing issue. So yes, and that's just one story. Shocks me. 72 people died because of how this industry operates.
And Hywel, as chair of BRAC, is that something you recognise? Do you see this? Does government see that too few are engaged?
I don't mind answering for myself, David. I'm not going to try and answer for the government at the moment because that's a little bit of a moving challenge, I think. But certainly for my part, frankly, I'm appalled at the lack of engagement with what happened at Grenfell, with the public inquiry. And I'm delighted we've got people in this room who feel prepared. I've seen some recent statistics that would reverse that. I think there's an awful lot of the industry who just don't seem to be prepared to understand that what Will put up, and which I'm with you, David, it was 8 common sense bullet points. I didn't expect to hear bad language at a BESA event, by the way. That last bullet point with the reference to you know what engineering. It's nothing to do with value and it's not engineering. It's just cost cutting. But those 8 points, they're not controversial at all. They're what the industry should do on a daily basis. And actually, there are significant chunks of what's up there that it will be impossible to meet the new gateway process for the higher risk buildings without doing all of those 8. So anybody working on higher risk buildings, get Will's slide, follow it. But that will be viewed. The reason you're nervous about it is because you know that there are many people out there who will think it's controversial, who will think it's all a bit radical and a bit too expensive and we're all overreacting. We're not. You started by asking what I think. I think we're failing to deal with Grenfell as we should as an industry.
Ben, you take briefs from clients, and I often say that in the construction, we're often under the misapprehension the client wants a building. They want a return on investment, which is a different thing. Is that something that you're seeing, that clients really don't understand their responsibilities and the input they have into safe design?
I think it depends on the client. We've never spent more of our time engaging with these issues in design and earlier in the design process than we used to. So from a personal point of view and what we do, it's front and centre, and it affects everything. It affects products, it affects components, it affects testing, and it's all happening sooner. I think the conclusion is a bit convenient, because you've got a contractor saying, get the design done earlier, don't pass over any risk, and give it to us ready to go. It's like, I get that. And you're also saying, make sure everything is tested. You know, let's build a piece of a building, set fire to it, measure it, learn from that, and then go on and build it. We say, okay, good ideas, agree with both of those things, but you've just added 2 years to a project. But what we've got our clients to do is start earlier. But you've got to see this coming, not 3 years out, but 5. And you've got to start committing money to a design process 5 years out from getting on site. They don't know what's going to happen next month at the moment politically, so asking them to have 5 years of foresight is difficult. So we push for that as hard as we can, but we're not a very loud voice in starting design processes, because we're the recipient of it. And I think it does come down to then who your clients are. Clients are engaged with this stuff and as close to it as the people on this panel. Will start sooner. We'll do all the things that we've talked about, but I don't see it across the industry. I see a group of clients, mostly in London, you know, exceeding best practice, if you like, doing things right. But if you were to look generally, I don't think that would be the case at all.
And Peter, what's the Arup view on this? How do you see, we've heard some from Gill, but your side of Arup, shall we say, what do you see?
I mean, we absolutely have to learn the lessons and you know, to take the, we have to change the industry in how we undertake all of our work and how we design, construct and operate buildings. The result of the previous system was, you know, was Grenfell. And we have to do things, you know, in a significantly changed way. And it's not, and a lot of it is around the things that are some of the key themes of the recent Building Safety Act in terms of responsibility, defining who is responsible exactly for what. And if you don't know, so, you know, agree it until you do. And information, which is giving, as somebody said previously, the right information to the right people to enable them to discharge their duties and operate their building. And it is going to be a step change, but it is absolutely necessary that this happens from a safety point of view, but also from just you know, owners being able to understand how to maintain and operate their building. So very much looking for step changes, going to the clients thing, trying to work with clients who are on this journey, and I do think it's a journey that we're on at the moment, trying to work with clients who are trying to be proactive about that and trying to help those who are possibly less proactive at the moment to understand where we think they should be going, and trying to provide some leadership in terms of those things to enable us to get further on this journey.
If we look at the first poll, it's not really very conclusive, and bearing in mind about preparedness of companies, bearing in mind this is an informed audience. So many people read nothing, look at nothing, have no interaction with the Building Safety Act at all, is a bit depressing. Will, do you see that in your supply chain? Is that something we should be very concerned about, that lack of preparedness?
I think it is something that we should be concerned about. I think people want to do the right thing, and they are to some extent chomping at the bit, but they're perhaps waiting to be told what exactly that is that they need to do. If you take the golden thread, for example, I think there might be a perception that people are waiting to be told exactly how to demonstrate compliance with that. And that may not actually come. So I think to some extent it's about getting on doing that now. So I think, yes, to some extent it's a mixed bag, but I think most people want to do the right thing.
Great. Hywel, we've talked about people being competent and compliant. How should contractors go about evidencing that competence and compliance?
Well, I'm tempted to say mischievously, you mean they're not doing that at the moment, are they? I mean, I'm sure that Laing O'Rourke have got a reasonable idea of who they're employing, what people like Will, they know what Will's qualifications and competencies are. They've got a reasonable record of all their technical people. I'd like to think that's all in place already. I do wonder how much some of the second-tier organisations are doing that. And the impression I'm getting is that there will be a chunk of the industry who are going to say, first of all, wrongly, oh, this is only about higher risk buildings. No, it isn't. It's about anything that requires building regulations approval, from a domestic extension to a 50-storey non-residential tower block and all the... If it comes under the Building Act, it comes under the Building Safety Act. And if anybody tells you otherwise, I'm sorry, in the nicest possible way, they don't know what they are talking about. And my apologies if anybody in the room came in with that view. The Building Safety Act is about all buildings that come under building regs. There will be some small stuff, domestic extensions. You're not going to have the building safety regulator coming round to check your domestic extension. It isn't going to happen unless the extension collapses and there's a fatality, and then you're going to have everybody on your case. Now, domestic extension's a bit extreme. In the middle ground, there's going to be a whole load of stuff where people will be expected to comply, and it will be a little bit like self-assessment tax. You put in your assessment, it's processed and treated as accurate until and unless the tax people think there's a reason to look into it more. That will happen with a lot of building control. And if something goes wrong, they will turn up. And then the question is, how are we going to show them that the people who worked on this project were competent? How are we going to show them that we checked up on that? What evidence did we ask for? And I'm afraid Nanny State is not going to give you the Janet and John book of how to assess competence. It's going to say, you've got a responsibility to do it. You're supposed to be competent to run your business. You get on and do it. And if it goes wrong, we'll come and ask you how. Now, that's a bit of a change of approach to anything we've had before. I've said enough to trigger
I agree with everything that Hal said. I just want to come back on one minor point. I think when you look at a lot of the specialist trades, that particularly in the MEP world, demonstrating competence is tricky because there aren't always ways to be able to do that. But I think there is work to do in terms of how you do demonstrate competence in some of the more nuanced and specialist areas.
I'm going to come on to that in a bit more detail. But Gill, just something I raised in the sort of my opening speech this morning was that we can't trust government not to row back on stuff. You heard through the Grenfell inquiry ministers giving their evidence about they didn't really know what they were doing and they didn't realise about this, and the bonfire of regulations that they set in place, they didn't understand the consequences. Unbelievably, I heard ministers talking recently about another bonfire of regulations. Is the Building Safety Act safe, do you think, under this government?
I don't think I can comment on that. I think what I would say about that, so I can't comment politically, who knows what's going to happen. I would hope so. But my point is always that regulations are minimum requirements anyway. And if you talk about a moral argument, what it does do is to begin to set out a path for learning from Grenfell. So whatever happens, I would say. I do just want to add one point though on the change of industry thing, because I'm slightly worried about the narratives around it at the minute. Is there seems to be a making industry wrong. So it's kind of, you should have changed. That might be accurate. I just don't think it's a helpful conversation. And I think we should start to engage with why is change not happening. I mean, the construction industry hasn't changed for decades and decades and decades after report after report after report. So there's a learning disability within the industry, and keeping on going, you should change, you should change, you should change. And my experience of change is actually not helpful. So I think it might be more useful, and I think particularly with kind of like the complexity of supply chains and multiple contractors, to understand what are the barriers to change. So I would just like to see that conversation change a little bit.
Peter, then Hywel.
I was just going to add, I mean, I think one of the things we're not talking about enough is the positive, it's like the things we've done wrong, and it's about the costs and the difficulties, things like that. There are positive things that come out of this, of the ways we're going to have to work in terms of things like de-risking projects and building by having, more decisions made earlier when they can be rectified, in terms of being clear on responsibilities. So when we get to the construction stage, we're not looking at something and saying, how did we get here? There's a lot of, I also see a lot of positives in this change. It's not just you've been doing it wrong and you've got to, you've therefore got to change. There are some good reasons for doing this, for good outcomes, even as far as the project itself goes. And we should, we ought to be, focusing on some of those, and a lot of those are around risk, and particularly now when if there was to be an incident and a subsequent investigation, in terms of how you have protected yourselves from risk, that is all, I think, a more positive. That there are positives that I think can help drive this change and keep these changes. Keep us on that journey towards actually getting these changes as part of the industry.
Hywel, you.
I just wanted to pick up, I think Gill makes a good point around, Dame Judith herself has been quoted a number of times saying the industry isn't getting on with it fast enough. And I get where she's coming from, but we've got an act, and I do hope to goodness that nobody thinks rowing back on the act is on. But it's going to be followed up by regulations, lots of them. We've just had a massive consultation, which CIBSE and BESA and others have been very busy responding to. And we're now waiting to see what government does. And that's the catch. We know they're going to do stuff. They've got the enabling powers. They're going to pass regulations. But we don't know exactly what those regulations are yet. And there is therefore legitimate regulatory uncertainty. And if you're running a big business and you know you've got to change, you really want to do it once. You don't want to have a go at guessing, make some changes, and then find that actually the government's done it slightly differently after all, and now you've got to make another lot of changes. So I think that the responsible leaders in the industry, when they say we need more clarity over what the regs are going to say before we can nail down certain decisions, I think actually that's good management, that's good governance, it's understandable. And I would agree with Gill, we do need to be kept, we can't beat industry up for doing those things. It's the ones who say, oh, it's not going to affect me, I'm not going to bother. They're the ones who need a good beating up, because that's just not the right answer at whatever level it is in the industry.
Well, in BESA, we made our competence assessment standard, which is a requirement of membership, more robust, focused more technically on can you actually do the job. Did we make a mistake with that? Because we're ahead of the market without a doubt. Is that something you would welcome? You're all nodding, I hope so.
Yeah, absolutely, David.
Yeah.
I would add on competence. So one of the things, and I haven't studied all of this in detail, but one of the things is we have to move just beyond just technical competence. So when we're talking particularly around viewing buildings as a system and learning to collaborate and cooperate across supply chains. There are a lot of non-technical skills and competencies that are required to do that well. And in most of the documentation I've seen around competence, and again, I haven't studied everything, that non-technical stuff is not coming through strongly enough. And I think that's where change will happen, is in the non-technical skills, not just in the technical skills. So just that's my view on competence.
Ben, you look like you want to comment on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to speak a little bit about competence, but also something Gill said earlier about systemic change and working together. I think we have quite effective project teams now where people like Will are in the room much sooner. Everybody is more enfranchised. And I think it goes beyond competence for me. And you start with competence, you sort of move towards pride, whether it's professional pride or pride in what you're doing if you're part of the supply chain, and you end up at responsibility. And for me, the real failing and tragedy of Grenfell was that complete opacity on responsibility. And who can I blame? Who can I pass the blame on to? Like, it can't be my fault, it must be somebody else's. There was just a sort of horrible panic, shifting of blame all over the place. And I think the only way to really diffuse that and get people, I think, back to what we used to do well as the design part of the industry is to say, look, you're all responsible for it, all of you, jointly and severally liable for this, but don't get it wrong. And until we do that, I don't think our industry will change enough, because people will remain siloed. There will be, okay, I've done this piece of work, who do I ask whether it's okay or not? I'll pass it to them, and they'll pass it to Will, and we'll pass it to somebody else. And you can quickly see that you get a better version of what happened at Grenfell. And that's not good enough, is it? It can't be good enough.
Peter, so a question from a room full of contractors. So bear that in mind. Should the consultant take responsibility for fire safety design and not throw it over the fence to the contractor?
I think, well, actually, just going back to Ben's point, the consultant is not responsible for fire safety on their own. And I think, but equally well, they are, just throwing it over the fence to the next person down is also, is not an acceptable way of discharging those responsibilities. And one of the things, and, issues like explaining to the contractors what the residual risks you have from a fire safety strategy, what you are expecting them to do, mitigate, whatever, and agreeing that. So I don't think, I think the consultant has a significant responsibility, but I don't think they keep it all. And the important thing, again, coming back to Ben's thing, is the collaboration in discharge, in the project as a whole, meeting its responsibilities. And I think that's where we've got to get to. And a lot of that is going to be consultants understanding better what they are asking contractors to do. And one of the things for our young graduates and things like that is getting them out on site to see, to see how some of the decisions that we make actually work out when somebody's trying to construct them on site. And that is an eye-opener.
I have not done this exercise, but I wouldn't mind betting that if you did a search of all the transcripts from Grenfell evidence, the most used words would something like assumed. I assumed that somebody else did it. Was always seemed to be there. Gill, is that something that's gone? You're no longer going to be able to use that I assumed somebody else, or could you ever use that defence?
Well, so one of the things, I was just reading this, so this guy, Jim Weatherby, is a former NASA astronaut, and he mentored me and has made a huge impact in my life. And to the competency thing, NASA uses knowledge, skills, and attitude. whereas we use knowledge, skills, and experience. And it's that kind of like attitudinal pride that I think makes a huge difference. So that's just an aside on that point. You have to assure, you can't assume. I mean, that's just bad management. I kind of, my head just gets a little bit boggled about that. Like, how do you pass off that something's safe, assuming? But have people set up accurate and effective assurance mechanisms to make sure that everybody in a supply chain is performing as they should perform. And key to it is looking for vulnerabilities. I mean, I think there's this notion that everything will go perfectly. It's never going to go perfectly. So how can you create an environment where people can freely speak about the challenges, and then you can collectively deal with the challenges because you have the intellectual capacity and wisdom to do that? Not quite sure that directly answered the question, but that's my rambling.
Good enough for me. Will, you brought up a slide about gateways and a question really about the effectiveness of gateways. So we've got one that says, what tests should be put in place in regards to a fire strategy? So I'm assuming that's about the gateways. Are you seeing that proper tests being put in place now, or is that something that's still up in the air?
Yes, to an extent. I think it is being done. Is it being done universally? Possibly not. But I mean, I think with fire strategy reviews, I can only speak for our organisation, but we would review the fire strategy whenever they come in and try and evaluate the risk inherent within that. But that is a challenge because fire strategies may be fairly simplistic in their level of detail, and there may be a lot of stuff that's missing that needs to be worked out later. So again, really difficult to give a universal answer on that, but I think, the will is there.
Great. I'm glad you're going to come in, Hywel, because I've got a further question is to answer after your point. How long is this all going to take before we've actually got some idea of what the future is going to look like? So when everything is in place?
Right. I wanted to come in because there's a really important caveat here. Gateways and golden thread only apply to higher risk buildings. And higher risk buildings are over 18 metres or 7 or more stories. And it looks as though they're going to be anything with 2 or more residential units during design, construction and operation, and hospitals and care homes that meet the height thresholds in design and construction. And that's what the definition looks like. So gateways and golden thread only apply as a requirement to those. I'd like to see the golden thread applied on many, many more projects, but that's not the question you asked me. Timelines. We anticipate that the regulations are going to be introduced next spring, which I think means between January and April. I don't think it's civil service spring, which lasts until about mid-June. And we will probably get 6 months to get our heads around the regulations, and things will start to come in October. And from next October, people operating a higher risk building will have to have 6 months to register it with the HSE, with the Building Safety Regulator. The gateway system will begin to come into operation for projects that start after a certain date. Exactly what that transition looks like is still unclear. The consultation was asking questions on it. But if it's a residential building and it's above the threshold, it will be a higher risk building sometime between now and 2025. It will come under the regulator in operation. So even if you're working on one today and you think, oh, the new rules haven't come in yet. No, they haven't, but they will do at some point. And if you've bluntly not done things properly, I think there are enough provisions in the Act about defective premises that your client will be back asking you for a major contribution, putting right all the things you're not doing now. So in terms of timescales for higher risk resi, you really need to be thinking about it today. The things like the gateways will kick in probably late next year, early the following year, as far as we know at the moment, subject to other political considerations.
Okay, well, Time is up, but I'm going to run on a bit if you don't mind, just for a couple more questions. I've got one for Hywel, and then I'm going to ask you all one question at the end, which is, what should these people do when they leave now to make sure they've started that journey on the preparedness? We're looking at the other poll behind us about their confidence level, and 79% are either a little confident or quite confident, only 14% very confident. So how should they go away and prepare? What's the one thing they should do? Before I do that, Hywel, another question on the Building Safety Act. Am I right in understanding there is political consensus over the Building Safety Act, and that if we had a change of government, it wouldn't have wholesale change?
I would be amazed if there was a change of governing party, if there was any rowing back. I just wonder if actually the pace of change might be pushed a bit harder. How easy it is to push it faster, I don't know, but I think it might be pushed harder, and I think there would be more expectations on the industry to really show it's stepping up to the plate. But I can't see there being any political scenario in which we row back on the Building Safety Act. And at a personal level, I hope to goodness I'm right.
I think we all hope for that. So I'm going to start with Will and then work my way down there. Will, what should these good people do when they get to their office tomorrow that's going to help them with the Building Safety Act?
That's a really, really difficult question to answer because there's so many things. I think probably I'll try two things. For me, try and work out how you can demonstrate your own competence. And that is a difficult thing to do because there might not always be things to be able to back up on that. But that would be the first thing. Second thing is if you see anything that is wrong, call it out. Have the courage to call it out.
Yeah, good point. Gill.
I'm not going to comment on the Building Safety Act because you all know it better than I do. Is think about the impact or consequences of your decisions and choices on the building system, not just on your part of the contract.
Ben.
I mean, I've kind of said it already, but I'd encourage you all to take responsibility for what you do and make everybody else who's working with you do the same. Don't let anyone wriggle out of anything best you can.
Peter.
A lot of agreement with what's just been said. I mean, I think to consider, are you clear on how you are making the right decisions, employing the right people? It's just, doing all the things that you for which you are responsible. How do you know? And do you need to essentially set that out better than you are currently?
Oh.
Find out who in your business gets up in the morning and thinks, what does my business need to know about the Building Safety Act today? Find out who they are. If they don't exist, then suggest it would be a good idea, and then listen to them, help them, and find out what they're trying to do and what they're saying. There's a shed load of stuff coming down the track.
Thank you. And I would add that we've got some great advice on our website, and that will be adapted as regulations come through. And we're doing what we can to prepare you for that. As we said, we're ahead of the market, but we think it's money in the bank for you guys to be able to evidence your competence, particularly on a technical level, and we'll be continuing with that. So, could you please thank the panel for some genuine expert advice, and thank you.